I should have just stuck to flipping through the shelves. I wasn't even planning to buy anything. It was one of those days when you kill time wandering, no real purpose, just something to do. Goodwill's book section is always a mess, bent-up paperbacks, dusty encyclopedias nobody wants, some old magazines stacked carelessly on top. I was running my fingers along the spines when I noticed it. A magazine that didn't belong. It was wedged between a 1998 Reader's Digest and a tattered cookbook, its cover a faded mustard yellow. The title, in plain black font, simply read, The Informer. No date. No barcode. No publisher's mark. Nothing. The cover illustration looked like a photocopy of a blurred street scene, the kind of image you'd see in a surveillance report. Something about it made my stomach tighten, though I couldn't say why. I flipped through the pages. At first, it seemed like any old magazine, advertisements for products I'd never heard of, articles about historical events I'd never read in textbooks. But then I saw something that made my skin crawl. A page near the middle had a black and white photograph of a house. My house. Not just my house, but my house today. The details were unmistakable, the slightly leaning mailbox, the dead patch of grass by the driveway, the exact arrangement of my porch furniture. The caption below it was just as unsettling. Residence, 1, night activity, unconfirmed. Status, pending. I ran my thumb over the page, feeling the slight indentation of type. This wasn't some old magazine from decades ago, it knew where I lived. It knew I lived alone. My first thought was that this was some elaborate prank. Maybe one of my friends messing with me, slipping this into the stacks, waiting for me to find it. But I hadn't told anyone I was going to Goodwill. Hell, I hadn't even planned to come here myself. The next page was worse. A list of names, each with an address and status next to it. Some marked pending like mine. Others said observed. A few were crossed out entirely, the ink thick and aggressive. But it was the last name that made my breath catch. My name. My address. Status, pending. I shut the magazine fast, my hand shaking. The Goodwill employee, a teenage girl in a faded blue vest, glanced at me from the register, bored. She hadn't seen what I found. No one had. I didn't even think. I walked straight to the counter and bought it. $1. That's all it took to take whatever this was home with me. I should have left it there. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the magazine spread out in front of me like a crime scene. I went through it again, looking for anything I might have missed. The articles were bizarre, some written like regular news pieces, others more like warnings. One was about a missing man in Cincinnati, last seen outside his house 3 days before his status in the magazine changed from pending to crossed out. Another described a pattern of strange disappearances near certain homes, people vanishing without a trace after a final visit. Then I turned to the last few pages. They weren't blank anymore. I know they were empty when I flipped through them at Goodwill. I would have noticed. But now, under the dim glow of my kitchen light, there was something new. A message. Do not answer the door tonight. I slammed the magazine shut. My whole body went cold. I sat there, staring at the cover, feeling that creeping sensation you get when you realize you're not alone. I looked at the clock. 2:57 a.m. Then, 3 knocks at the door. I stared at the door, my pulse hammering against my ribs, each knock echoing inside my skull. The magazine lay open in front of me, its final message carved into my thoughts like a warning I should have never ignored. Do not answer the door tonight. The words throbbed in my mind, mocking the part of me that wanted to believe this was all some elaborate joke. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to think. Maybe it was nothing, just some late-night delivery driver at the wrong address, maybe a neighbor in need of help. But the knock had been too precise, too deliberate. 3 slow raps, each one measured and expected, as if whoever was outside knew I was awake. My kitchen light was on. My car was in the driveway. They knew. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I unlocked the screen, but there were no notifications, no missed calls, no messages explaining why someone would be at my door at nearly 3 in the morning. My stomach twisted as I realized that even if I wanted to call the cops, I had no real reason to. Someone knocking at my door wasn't a crime. But something deep in my gut, something primal, told me this wasn't just someone. This was something else. The air felt thick, wrong, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. The knock came again, exactly the same as before. 3. Slow taps. Not louder, not more insistent, just the same eerie rhythm, patient, waiting. I forced myself to stand, my chair scraping against the tile as I moved away from the table. The floor felt colder beneath my feet, as if the warmth had been sucked from the house the moment I read that message. My breath came shallow and uneven as I crept toward the door, every muscle in my body tense, fighting the overwhelming urge to look. The peephole was right there, just a tilt of my head away, but my instinct screamed don't. Instead, I stopped a few feet from the door and listened. Silence. No footsteps shifting outside, no rustling of fabric, no quiet shuffling of a person adjusting their weight. Whoever, whatever, was out there was perfectly still. The realization sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. I hesitated, my hand hovering near the deadbolt, my body betraying me with the urge to confirm what my mind did not want to know. Then, a voice. It didn't come from the other side of the door. It came from inside the house. You shouldn't have taken it. The words slithered through the air, too close, too intimate, like someone standing just behind me. My entire body seized with panic as I spun around, my phone's flashlight flicking unreflexively, the beam slicing through the darkened hallway leading to the rest of the house. Nothing. But the voice had been real, low and empty of emotion, the kind of voice that didn't belong to a person but something that only pretended to be. My stomach clenched as I took a slow step back toward the kitchen, the muscles in my neck tight as I fought the overwhelming urge to check behind me. I knew if I looked, I'd see something I wasn't supposed to. A sound broke the silence, the soft creak of floorboards, light and deliberate, coming from the hallway. The way of footsteps. My mouth went dry as I raised the phone's flashlight again, my hands damp with sweat, the cold glow spilling down the corridor. The hallway was empty. The doors to the other rooms were closed, exactly as I had left them. But the feeling of being watched, of something standing just out of sight, was suffocating. I backed away, my shoulder pressing against the wall as I forced myself to breathe. And then, the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't the same slow, patient rhythm. It was different. Wrong. The 3 deliberate knocks turned into 4. Then 5. Then 6. A steady, unnatural tapping, too fast, too precise, as if fingers were drumming against the wood instead of knocking. My whole body locked up as my mind screamed that this was no longer someone politely asking for entrance. This was something else entirely, and it was losing patience. I turned toward the door, my body bracing against the sickening weight of knowing whatever was on the other side was not human. The air around me felt warped, stretched too thin, as if the space between the walls had become smaller, pressing inward, suffocating. My phone vibrated suddenly in my hand, the sound nearly sending me through the roof. I looked down. Unknown caller. The knocking stopped. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Everything in me screamed not to answer, but my body betrayed me, my fingers moving as if something unseen had already made the decision for me. I lifted the phone to my ear. The call connected. Silence on the other end. A long, breathy pause. Then, a voice, whispering in perfect unison with my own heartbeat. Hey. It's me. The blood drained from my face. My own voice, distorted, wrong, bleeding through the speaker in a soft, almost apologetic tone, as if I was the one standing outside, trying to get in. The static behind the voice was thick, almost like breathing, shifting with something just beneath the surface, something waiting to break through. My throat tightened as I lowered the phone, my skin cold with the sudden awareness that the air around me had changed. The silence was deeper now. More suffocating. The walls, the floors, the very air itself, it was listening. The magazine was still open on the kitchen table, its pages slightly curled at the edges as if it had aged overnight. The ink had changed, the words no longer printed but scrawled. The same morning, but different now. It knows you're awake. And then, just beyond the phone's dying static, I heard it. A breath. A low exhale. Not from the speaker. Not from the door. From right behind me. I did not turn around, though every part of me wanted to. My muscles locked tight, frozen between the desperate instinct to look and the deeper, suffocating certainty that doing so would be a mistake. The breath at my back was too close, slow, measured, expectant, waiting for something from me. My fingers dug into the edge of the kitchen table, the warped wood grounding me as my thoughts spun wildly, the pounding of my pulse almost louder than the silence. My phone screen had gone dark, but the call was still connected. My voice still crackled through the speaker, an eerie, distorted echo of myself. I could hear it breathing. The house felt different now, not just wrong, but altered. The air was thick, pressing on me like an invisible weight, the familiar shapes of the room subtly distorted as if the walls had drawn closer, shrinking around me. A suffocating pressure crept through my chest, a deep, animal awareness that I was not alone, that whatever had been outside was no longer waiting. It had come in. Then the knocking started again, but softer now, a slow and deliberate rhythm, patient, waiting. The sound sent a cold rush of nausea through me because I knew, with a sick certainty, that the sound was no longer coming from the front door. It was coming from inside the house. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting against the instinct to react, to confirm what my mind already understood. The knocking continued, unhurried, deliberate, as though testing me, waiting to see if I would acknowledge it. My body ached with tension, my breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts as I tried to steady myself. Then came the whisper, but it wasn't a sound in the room. It wasn't spoken. It was inside my head. Let me in. The words slithered through my thoughts, coated in something too familiar, something thin and fragile, as if my own mind had been compromised, forced to betray me. My stomach twisted violently, and I struggled to swallow against the rising bile in my throat. My gaze flickered to the magazine still open on the table, and my blood ran cold. The ink had changed again. The letters were no longer printed neatly on the page, but scrawled, etched, burned into the paper as if something had carved them with deliberate force. Where's your voice now? A hollow feeling expanded in my chest as I realized what had happened, what I had invited into my home. It wasn't just a warning. It was an invitation. My mind grasped for logic, for some reason behind it, but deep down, I knew there wasn't one. The moment I had opened the magazine, the moment my eyes had traced its words, it had been watching me. The breath behind me shifted, closer now, the air turning ice cold against the back of my neck. My legs trembled, screaming for release, but I held firm, knowing that if I moved too soon, I would see something I wasn't meant to see. I forced my thoughts onto a single point, a single chance, the door. If I could reach the front door, if I could break whatever was holding me inside this moment, maybe I could still leave. But what if that was what it wanted? What if everything, the knocking, the whispers, the presence in the room, had been a carefully placed trap to drive me towards something waiting just beyond the threshold? The knocking stopped. The breath behind me stilled. And then, the silence changed. It wasn't empty. It was heavy, full, as if something had simply paused, listening. My jaw clenched as my body forced itself into motion, slow and deliberate, every nerve screaming as I turned, finally facing the hallway. The space ahead of me was empty, but the air hummed with something unseen, something that had just been there. I could still feel it, its presence lingering in the corners of my vision, just out of reach. My breath shuddered in my chest as my eyes landed on something even worse. The closet door. It had been closed. I was certain of it. But now, it stood open, just a crack. A thin sliver of darkness stretched into the hallway, and my stomach twisted as I registered the feeling of being watched. My legs felt numb as I stepped forward, my vision sharpening on the shadow beyond the doorframe. The air inside was wrong, too deep, too vast, as if the closet was no longer just a small space within my home but an opening into something else entirely. My fingers twitched, aching to reach for the door and slam it shut, but I stopped myself because something inside was moving. The noise was almost imperceptible, a soft, deliberate shift, not the rustling of fabric or forgotten belongings, but breathing. Slow. Inhale. Exhale. The shape of something just beyond the threshold. My skin crawled with the undeniable certainty that I was not alone. Then, a hand emerged. It did not lunge. It did not grab. It simply appeared, pale fingers curling around the edge of the doorframe. The joints were too sharp, the knuckles bent at angles that did not belong to anything human. The skin was wrong. Not flesh, not even something mimicking flesh, it was paper. The yellowed, aged paper of the magazine. A choked gasp caught in my throat as I stumbled back, my body colliding with the wall, the edges of my vision darkening with the realization of what I was seeing. It hadn't just been watching. It had been waiting. The magazine was never just an object. It was a doorway. A vessel. A way for something else to step through. The fingers twitched, shifting slightly. Another hand emerged, gripping the doorframe. The sound of tearing filled the air, pages flipping violently as something peeled itself into existence. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't in my head. It was my own voice. Hey. It's me. A dry chuckle, brittle as crumpling paper, echoed from the closet. My stomach twisted, my body reacting before my mind could. I ran. My feet slammed against the wooden floor as the hallway seemed to shrink, the walls narrowing, the door at the end of the hall suddenly farther away than it should have been. Behind me, the sound of pages shifting, unfolding, moving. The laughter followed. My fingers fumbled with the deadbolt as I reached the front door, my breath ragged, my hands slick with sweat. I didn't dare look back. If I looked, it would be real. The lock gave way, and I yanked the door open. And froze. The night outside was wrong. It wasn't my street. It wasn't even a place. It was paper. Flat. Blank. A printed imitation of my neighborhood, stretching endlessly in every direction, the houses nothing more than shadows on a page. I stumbled back, my body trembling as the truth settled in. I hadn't brought the magazine into my house. The magazine had brought me inside of it. And as I turned, as the hallway behind me filled with the rustling of pages, as the thing in the closet laughed in my voice, I finally understood. I was never going to leave. I staggered backward, my breath shallow, my mind rejecting what my eyes were telling me. The world outside my door was flat, a two-dimensional imitation of reality, stretching out in endless repetition. The houses were drawn, their windows mere smudges of ink, the trees along the street printed, motionless, without life. The sky was nothing more than a blank, yellow page, stained with age, curling at the edges where it met the horizon. The air was still, thick with an unnatural silence, as if the world had been reduced to nothing but a picture, a memory of something real. I turned back toward the hallway, my pulse hammering, the magazine still lying open on the kitchen table, its pages shifting as though breathing. The thing that had emerged from the closet was still unfolding, limbs made of paper, moving with an eerie, weightless fluidity. Its fingers twitched, the joints bending too far, too sharply, its face still obscured by the shadows of the room. The laughter that had followed me moments ago was gone now, replaced by something worse, silence. A silence that watched. A silence that waited. The house around me felt less like a house now, its walls too smooth, too perfect, as if they too had been drawn rather than built. The floor beneath me felt thin, fragile, as though at any moment I might fall through the pages into something deeper, something worse. My breath came in short, sharp bursts as I took a careful step back toward the door. The paper sky outside might not have been real, but neither was this. I had no choice. I had to move. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the world shifted. A crack ran through the paper beneath me, splitting open like a tear in the page. The ground beneath my feet buckled, a deep, guttural sound filling the air, not from any creature, but from the world itself, protesting my presence. I stumbled, my body lurching forward, but instead of hitting the pavement, I fell into something else. I fell into the page. It was like being swallowed whole, my body twisting in waveless freefall, the air around me nothing but ink and whispers. Shapes flickered past me, words, images, fragments of stories I had never read. I caught glimpses of faces, half-formed figures, eyes without pupils watching from between paragraphs. The world folded and unfolded around me, shifting through endless pages, each one leading to another, and another, and another. Then, without warning, I stopped. I was standing in a hallway. Not my hallway. This one was longer, stretching far beyond what the dimensions of my house should allow. The wallpaper was faded, its patterns twisting and changing when I wasn't looking directly at them. The doors along the corridor were wrong, taller than they should have been, their frames uneven, their doorknobs tarnished and rusted. The air smelled of old paper, of something forgotten. A soft scraping sound echoed from the far end of the hallway. I turned, my breath catching in my throat, as a shadow peeled itself away from the wall, unfolding like a page turning. And then, in my own voice, it spoke. "You shouldn't have taken it." The voice that echoed down the hallway was mine, but it wasn't me. It carried a strange detachment, like an old recording played back on damaged tape, distorted at the edges, hollow, stretched beyond recognition. My stomach twisted as the shadow at the end of the corridor shifted, peeling itself off the wall in slow, unnatural movements. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything at all. It was an imitation, a thing that had learned just enough to sound like me, move like me, but was still something else entirely. I took a slow step backward, my breath barely controlled, my hands curled into fists at my sides. The floor beneath me felt thinner than before, like I was standing on the surface of a page that could crumple at any moment. The hallway stretched longer the more I looked at it, the doors warping, shifting position like they were waiting for me to make a choice. I didn't dare look at the walls. I could feel them watching. The thing that spoke in my voice took a step forward. It didn't walk. It folded. One moment, it was distant, its shadow barely defined against the dim light, and the next, it was closer, its limbs unfolding with the dry sound of turning pages. It was paper, but it wasn't. The texture of it rippled, its edges curling slightly as though I could reach out and peel it apart. But I knew if I touched it, if I even acknowledged it beyond what my mind could comprehend, it would become real. "You shouldn't have taken it," it repeated, its voice slipping slightly, a layer of something else beneath it now. The voice wasn't entirely mine anymore. It was becoming something new. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I was trapped, caught in the pull of whatever force was holding me here. The magazine was more than just ink and paper, more than just a collection of pages filled with warnings. It was a place. A structure of stories, a world built not to be read, but to be lived in. I had turned the page, I had followed the words, and now I was inside something I didn't understand, something that had been waiting for someone like me to fill the blank spaces. I took another slow step back. The hallway seemed endless, a looping stretch of doors that were real but could be. My mind raced as I forced myself to focus, to make sense of the rules that had brought me here. Every story had rules. If this place followed the logic of a book, then there had to be a way out. The figure moved again. This time, it folded too fast. The sound of pages tearing filled the hallway as its form warped, stretched, its paper-thin limbs folding over themselves. Its face was almost visible now, almost mine, but the features weren't fully formed, as if it was still deciding what I was supposed to look like. The thing was trying to become me. I reached for the nearest doorknob without thinking. The metal was too cold, the tarnished brass burning against my palm as I twisted it. The door resisted at first, as if it wasn't meant to open, as if it wasn't meant for me. But then, with a sharp lurch, it gave way. The moment I stepped through, the world shifted again. I wasn't in the hallway anymore. I was somewhere else. The room was small, lit only by the dim glow of an unseen source. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, hundreds of them, stacked high, their spines cracked and yellowed with age. The air smelled of dust and ink, of something long forgotten. A wooden desk sat in the center, and atop it, lying open, was the magazine. The same one. The one I had found in Goodwill. Except this time, it was open to a page I hadn't seen before. And on it was a list of names. At the bottom of that list was mine. Status, pending. I staggered backward, my breath catching in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. This was a record, a catalog of everyone who had been pulled into this place, trapped in its pages, turned into nothing more than words waiting to be erased. My fingers hovered over the paper, the ink still fresh, as if my presence here had only just been recorded. The names above mine, dozens of them, had once been real people. Some were crossed out. Some had faded entirely, leaving nothing but blank spaces where they had once existed. I was running out of time. Behind me, the air shivered. The sound of pages shifting filled the space. I turned, too late. The thing from the hallway was standing in the doorway now, its form no longer a mere shadow. It had eyes now. It had my face. But something about it was off, its expression stretched too wide, its head tilting in small, unnatural jerks as though adjusting to a new shape. It took a slow step forward, the wooden floor creaking beneath its weight. I tried to speak, but my voice failed. The figure smiled. And then, in a voice that was almost mine, but not quite, it whispered, "Your story is ending." The thing that wore my face did not blink. It simply stood there, watching, waiting, its paper-thin body flickering at the edges, like a badly printed image struggling to hold its shape. I could feel the weight of its gaze pressing against my skin, though its eyes were empty, nothing more than blackened indentations where pupils should have been. My throat tightened as I stepped backward, careful not to make any sudden movements. The walls around me shifted, breathing, as if the entire space were adjusting to my presence, adapting to keep me here. The magazine lay open on the desk behind me, its pages fluttering despite the absence of wind, the ink bleeding into strange, twisting symbols I could no longer understand. The list of names remained, but something was different now, some of them were missing. My name was still there, still pending, but others had been erased, their spaces left blank, as though they had never existed at all. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. If those people had been here before me, if their names had once been part of this place and were now gone, then what had happened to them? What would happen to me if I didn't leave? The thought sent a deep, shuddering fear through my bones. I turned back to the figure in the doorway, my breath shallow. It had not moved, but its presence was stronger, the air around it rippling as if it was beginning to take up more space. The thing had been waiting for something, for me to react, to acknowledge it, to give it permission to continue the story. But I refused. I would not turn the next page. I forced myself to step forward instead of back, forcing my body to move against the fear crawling up my spine. "You don't belong here," I said, though my voice was barely more than a whisper. The thing tilted its head. The motion was slow, deliberate, as if testing the way its limbs should move, the way my face should react. The corners of its mouth stretched into something that might have once been a smile, but it was all wrong. It was too wide, too sharp, the skin pulling like stretched paper, crinkling at the edges. "But you do," it said, in my own voice. The walls shuddered. The pages of the magazine shifted, their words rearranging themselves, rewriting reality in real time. I could feel something tugging at me, something pulling at the edges of my existence, as if I were coming apart, as if I were being replaced. My knees nearly buckled under the pressure, the weight of something unseen pressing against my skull, urging me to stay. I knew, with sudden, terrifying clarity, that the more I fought this place, the harder it would push back. It wasn't just a story, it was a force, and it wanted me written into it. I grabbed at the desk for balance, my fingers brushing against the warped pages, and for the briefest moment, I could see everything. The history of the magazine, the names that had come before me, the endless cycle of people drawn in, trapped, erased. Each one had played their part. Some had become characters, rewritten until they no longer resembled themselves. Others had vanished, turned into blank spaces where stories had once existed. And now it was my turn. The thing that wore my face took another step forward. The walls pressed in. The ink inside the magazine rippled. And then, the lights went out. For a long moment, there was nothing but darkness. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my chest, my body unable to move. The silence was thick, suffocating, wrapping around me like a second skin. But in that silence, I felt something shift. The presence in the room was no longer outside of me. It was inside. The voice came again, this time from everywhere. You are already part of the story. I opened my mouth to scream, but before I could make a sound, the world turned. The floor beneath me gave way, the walls crumpling, folding like paper. I fell, not down, not into anything solid, but into words. Into pages flipping, tearing, rewriting themselves. And the last thing I saw before the world went white was my name disappearing from the page. For a brief moment, I thought I had won. The sensation of falling through endless pages had stopped, the suffocating grip of the magazine lifting as I woke gasping for breath. My kitchen light flickered overhead, the familiar hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. My body ached, my hands trembling as I forced myself upright. The nightmare was over. I was back. But something felt off. The house was too still, not just quiet but wrong. The air lacked its usual warmth, and the faint creaks of the old wooden floorboards beneath me were missing. I listened for the distant city noise beyond my windows, the occasional passing car, the sound of a dog barking somewhere down the street. Nothing. The silence wasn't natural. It was controlled. The hum of the fridge was too steady, too perfect, as if it had been placed there as a placeholder, a detail in a world that wasn't quite real. I turned toward the kitchen table, expecting to see the shredded remains of the magazine, proof that I had destroyed it, that I had severed myself from its grasp. But there was nothing. No torn pages, no ink-stained surface, just empty space, as if it had never been there at all. My breath slowed, my fingers flexing as I stared at the blank tabletop. Was that it? Had I escaped? A cold dread curled in my gut, but I forced it down. I needed to step outside, to feel something real, something beyond these walls. Moving cautiously, I made my way to the front door, my pulse quickening as I reached for the knob. The cold metal felt solid under my grip, reassuring, grounding. I turned it and stepped out onto the porch and into silence. The street stretched ahead of me, unchanged but eerily lifeless. The street lamps flickered, their dim glow failing to push back the creeping shadows along the pavement. My neighbors' houses stood exactly as they should, their windows softly illuminated from within. But the lights inside were motionless. No shifting silhouettes, no television glow, no sign of life at all. The world had stopped. My throat tightened as I stepped onto the pavement, my breath shallow, my ears straining for any sound, wind, insects, the distant hum of a passing car. The weight of nothingness pressed against my skull, heavy and unnatural. Then I saw it. A single newspaper, neatly placed at the edge of my driveway, waiting. My stomach twisted as I approached it, the thin paper fluttering slightly, though there was no wind. I hesitated before picking it up, my fingers brushing against the surface. The ink shifted. The letters bled together, rearranging themselves as though the story was still being written, and then, as if settling into place, the words became clear. Local man reported missing, last seen at Goodwill. A sharp chill ran through my spine. Beneath the headline, in smaller text, was my name. My breath hitched, my chest tightening with panic. And then I saw the final line. Status, pending. I stumbled back, dropping the newspaper as if it had burned me. My mind reeled, my vision blurring at the edges. I had seen those words before. They had marked me when I first opened that cursed magazine. I had thought I escaped, thought I had broken free. But I hadn't. The magazine hadn't let me go. It had merely turned the page. A sickening realization settled over me like a weight. I wasn't back in the real world. I was still inside the story. The house behind me stood with its door slightly ajar, as if inviting me back inside. Had I left it open? I couldn't remember. I turned my gaze down the street, scanning for any sign of movement, any proof that something, anything, was real. And then I saw it. At the far end of the street, beyond the reach of the flickering streetlights, a figure stood motionless, watching. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out its features from this distance, but a deeper instinct told me exactly what it was. It was me. My body locked up, a cold sweat breaking across my skin. The figure didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't make a sound. It only watched. A wave of nausea rolled through me as I realized what was happening. This was the final stage. The magazine wasn't just recording me. It was replacing me. I turned, bolting for the house, slamming the door behind me as my lungs burned with each frantic breath. My hands trembled as I locked it, but I knew locks wouldn't matter. I had to think. There had to be a way out. I needed to understand the rules before the story could end. Then, from the kitchen, a sound. A soft rustling, like pages turning. I turned slowly, my pulse hammering. The table was no longer empty. A magazine sat there, waiting. But this time, the cover was different. The same title, The Informer, but beneath it, where there had once been a blurred street scene, was now a photograph of me standing in this very room. My stomach clenched as I stepped forward, drawn toward it despite every warning bell in my mind screaming at me to stop. The pages flipped open on their own, turning rapidly as the ink rearranged itself. The words scrawled across the page weren't static. They were shifting, changing in real time. I felt my breath stall as I realized what I was looking at. It was writing my actions. Right now. Every step I took. Every breath. The way my hand hovered over the paper, the hesitation pooling in my gut. I flipped to the final page, my heart pounding as I saw two words waiting for me. Choose an ending. The page split into two options, both written in identical type. Completion. Revision. Before I could react, the air behind me shifted. The lights dimmed. The walls of the house seemed to warp slightly, bending inward. And then, from the darkness of the hallway, I heard my own voice whisper, "Pick wisely." The whisper slithered through the air, curling around me like a thread pulling me deeper into the story. The voice was mine, but not quite right. It carried an echo, a distortion, as if something was mimicking the way I spoke but hadn't perfected the details. The house felt smaller, the walls pressing in subtly, the air thick like the weight of too many words packed into a space too small to hold them. The magazine still lay open on the table, its pages shifting slightly, expectant, as if waiting for me to choose. I stared at the two options. Completion. Revision. No explanation. No context. Just the simple demand that I finish the story. My hands trembled as I reached toward the page, hesitating at the last second. My instinct screamed that neither choice was safe, that the act of choosing alone meant submitting to whatever force had been controlling this nightmare from the moment I had picked up that magazine in Goodwill. Another sound, closer this time. A slow, deliberate creak from the hallway behind me. Not the aimless shifting of an old house settling. This was different. This was something moving. I didn't turn around. Every part of me wanted to look, to confirm what I already knew. But I had made that mistake before. The moment I acknowledged it, it would become real. I swallowed hard, my fingers pressing into the table's edge as I forced my breathing to slow. The creaking stopped. The air behind me was wrong, too heavy, too aware. I could feel something watching me, waiting. My hands clenched into fists. I had to think. If I was still inside the story, if the magazine was still controlling this world, then there had to be rules. If I had been given two endings, it meant there was a path out. I just had to find the right one. I exhaled sharply and moved. Not toward the magazine. Not toward the choices it was offering me. Instead, I turned away from the table and walked toward the hallway. The air shivered as if the house itself was caught off guard. The shadows seemed to shift slightly, reluctant to let me move freely. I took another step, and that was when I finally saw it. The mirror. It stood at the end of the hall, just beyond the reach of the dim light, a long, antique thing that had come with the house. I had barely noticed it before, had never even used it. But now, as I stared into it, my stomach twisted into knots. Because I wasn't reflected in it. The hallway was there, stretching infinitely within the glass, but my body cast no reflection. The breath hitched in my throat, my limbs locking in place. That wasn't possible. The light from the kitchen behind me should have cast a shape, a movement, something. Then, the mirror flickered. A shape formed. It stepped into view from the side, just out of frame. A figure identical to me, but delayed. My double's movements were slightly off, a half-second behind, like a badly synced video. It tilted its head, watching me with dark, unreadable eyes. Its expression was empty, as if still deciding what emotions to wear. I swallowed hard. I knew what this was. The story was preparing to replace me. A slow, crawling sensation spread through my skin. This wasn't the magazine trying to keep me here anymore. It was trying to overwrite me. If I chose an ending, if I allowed the story to close, it wouldn't be me who left this house. It would be this thing. The figure took a slow step forward inside the mirror, its movements smoother now, adjusting, refining. My breath hitched. No. I wasn't going to let it take my place. I turned on my heel and ran. The house reacted immediately. The walls rippled, stretching, pulling away. The floor tilted beneath my feet as I sprinted back toward the kitchen, toward the magazine, toward the only anchor keeping this world from collapsing in on itself. The air grew heavier, thicker, the sound of pages flipping violently filling my ears, drowning out my own breath. The house wasn't going to let me leave so easily. I reached the table, my fingers slamming against the open pages just as the lights flickered. The ink on the magazine shifted again, rearranging itself, no longer waiting for my choice. The decision was being made for me. I had run out of time. A whisper curled around me, my own voice whispering from the mirror, from the walls, from the pages themselves. This time, I get to leave. The shadows lunged. The darkness surged forward, the house itself warping, twisting, bending the laws of reality as the mirror image of me stepped through the glass. It didn't break. It didn't shatter. It simply peeled away like a thin layer of water as my reflection stepped onto the wooden floor. I turned just in time to see it straighten, adjusting itself, rolling its shoulders as if shaking off some unseen weight. It was perfect now. No delay. No hesitation. The slight distortion in its movements was gone. It was me, down to the smallest details. The way my chest rose and fell. The way my fingers twitched at my sides. But the eyes, those were still wrong. Flat. Black. Like ink soaking into a page, pooling in empty sockets. The magazine pages beneath my hand shuddered, the ink shifting faster, rewriting the scene in real time. The words scrawled themselves forward, narrating my every move, my breath, the tremble in my fingers. But now, there was something else. A new name. My replacement had been written in. My stomach twisted violently as I yanked my hands away from the pages, stepping backward as my other self took a slow step forward. The floor groaned beneath its weight, but it wasn't really weight at all. It wasn't human. It smiled. The kind of practiced expression that was meant to look natural but didn't quite reach the eyes. "Don't fight it," it said, voice identical to mine. "You knew this was coming." I shook my head. I destroyed the magazine. I tore it apart. The thing pretending to be me cocked its head, amused. "You read it first," it said simply. That's all it needed. The house lurched, the walls breathing again, pulling in and out, the floor beneath me stretching, not like wood, but like paper. The ink on the magazine was no longer just ink. It was alive, tendrils of black script curling across the surface, stretching outward, reaching for me. My entire body was being rewritten. I was running out of time. I lunged for the magazine, flipping through the pages, trying to find my name, trying to erase it, change it, undo it, but the ink had started running, bleeding together, as if I was already sinking too far in. The story had locked itself. It wasn't letting me edit the ending. But I still had one last option. The thing pretending to be me took another step forward, watching carefully, waiting for me to panic, to surrender. But I wasn't going to. I forced myself to breathe, gripping the edge of the table as I stared straight into its blackened eyes. "You need me to finish it," I said, my voice steadier now. "You need me to accept the ending." It didn't respond, but I saw it in the way its expression flickered, just for a moment. It had expected me to run, to resist. But I was finally playing by different rules. I reached for the pen. A single, simple object sitting beside the magazine, its surface slick with fresh ink. A writing tool. A way to change the story. If I couldn't delete what had been written, then I could still rewrite it. I slammed the pen down against the page, scrawling frantically, my breath sharp as I forced the words into existence. The duplicate failed. The replacement was incomplete. The original remained. The moment the final word was written, the magazine convulsed. The ink twisted, struggling against itself, trying to resist the new edition, but I had already taken control. I had forced a contradiction into the story. The thing pretending to be me let out a sound that wasn't human. It lurched backward, its form flickering, its skin peeling at the edges like wet paper. Its features were still mine, but they were breaking. The black pits of its eyes widened, its jaw twitching, trembling, its entire body folding inward. The magazine pages curled violently, ink dripping like blood, the walls of the house pulling tighter and tighter, collapsing in on themselves as the reality of this place started coming undone. It let out a choked, glitching sound, its mouth forming words that no longer existed. It had been erased. I ripped my hands away from the magazine as the final sentence burned itself into the page. The walls shattered. A rush of sound hit me like a tidal wave, wind, distant traffic, the sharp creak of my house's old wooden floor. The air was suddenly real again. I gasped, stumbling backward, the room tilting, the world tilting, before everything went black. I woke up on the kitchen floor. For a long moment, I didn't move. The cold towel pressed against my cheek, my body aching as if I had been crushed under something heavy. My chest rose and fell, slow and unsteady, my breath the only sound in the stillness of the room. I forced myself upright. The house was silent, but not like before. Not unnatural. Not flat. The air was real, heavy with the scent of coffee still lingering from earlier, the hum of the fridge blending into the distant sounds of the city outside my window. The magazine was gone. I turned toward the table, expecting to see it lying there, waiting for me, but the space was empty. No pages, no ink, no proof of what had happened. My hands shook as I pressed them against the wood, grounding myself. It was over. It had to be. I staggered toward the front door, unlocking it with trembling fingers, stepping onto the porch to feel something solid beneath my feet. The air was cool, the night quiet, the street alive again. A car rumbled past at the end of the block. A neighbor's window flickered with the glow of a TV. I was back. My breath hitched in relief, my pulse still racing as I exhaled slowly. I turned my gaze toward the driveway, half expecting to see a newspaper lying there, waiting for me. But there was nothing. No headlines. No rewritten reality. Just the wind rustling the leaves along the pavement. I had broken the story. I had written myself back in. And then, just as I let out a shaking breath, something in the distance caught my eye. Through the glass window of a Goodwill store across the street, stacked carelessly among a pile of old books and magazines. I saw it. The cover was different. The title had changed. The edges were crisper, newer, as if it had just been printed. And beneath the fresh, bold letters was a new face. Someone else's. My blood ran cold. The magazine had moved on. It was waiting for its next reader. I stood frozen on the porch, my breath caught in my throat, my body refusing to move as I stared through the dim glow of the Goodwill store's window. The magazine sat there, waiting, its fresh cover gleaming under the dull fluorescent lights, its title now different but carrying the same weight, the same trap. Someone else's face now graced the cover, a new story waiting to be told, a new name waiting to be written inside. My stomach churned with a deep, sick realization. I had escaped, but the cycle hadn't ended. I had forced the story to rewrite itself, had fought to reclaim my existence, but the magazine was never just about me. It needed someone. It always had. and now it had moved on. I forced myself to take a breath, trying to steady my hands, but the cold truth had already sunk in. This was never just a haunted object. This was a machine, a living thing that fed on stories, on people, on their existence. It didn't just trap them, it rewrote them, replaced them, erased them. How many had come before me? How many had been pulled into its pages, twisted into ink and paper, their lives snuffed out and replaced by something else? And worse, who was next? I took a step forward, toward the store, my instinct screaming at me not to, my mind battling itself in a war between self-preservation and guilt. I had fought so hard to get out. I had clawed my way free, rewritten myself back into reality, broken the cycle for me. But what about them? A blur of movement caught my eye. A man, early 20s, shaggy brown hair, worn-out jacket, standing just inside the Goodwill store, flipping idly through a stack of old books near the counter. His posture was relaxed, his attention wandering, completely unaware of what was waiting for him. His fingers traced along the spines, moving closer, brushing against the magazine. No. I took another step forward, faster now, my pulse hammering as my body moved on instinct. The man flipped to the first page, his head tilting in curiosity. He wasn't reading yet, just skimming, but it wouldn't take long. Once the words caught him, it was over. I was too far away. I ran. My feet hit the pavement hard as I sprinted across the street, my breath sharp in my chest, my hands balling into fists. The glass doors of the Goodwill came into focus, my reflection flashing in their surface just as I reached for the handle. And then the lights inside flickered. For just a second, everything inside the store warped, shifted. The shelves seemed taller, the space between them stretching unnaturally. The air turned thin, paper-like, as though reality itself was bending inward. The man was still there, but he was different now, his body flickering, shifting, like he was already being rewritten. His name was vanishing. The magazine was taking him. I threw the door open. The moment I stepped inside, the world snapped back into focus. The store was normal again. The air was still. The shelves stood just as they had before. The floor beneath me was solid, real. The magazine was gone. And so was the man. The space where he had been standing was empty. The books he had been holding lay scattered on the counter, untouched, abandoned. There was no sign of struggle, no sound, no trace that he had ever been there at all. A fresh chill ran down my spine as my gaze darted around the store, searching for any sign of what had happened. My breathing was shallow, my mind racing. I had been seconds too late. Seconds. I turned back toward the door, my hands shaking, my body numb. The street outside was quiet, the city lights flickering in the distance. I had escaped, but someone else had taken my place. The magazine had moved on. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, staring blankly at the night sky, my mind spiraling in the wake of what had just happened. I wanted to believe that maybe, somehow, he had escaped too. That maybe he was still out there, fighting his way back, the way I had. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had read my story. And now he was reading his. I swallowed hard, shoving my hands into my pockets as I walked away, my pulse still unsteady, my chest hollow. I had saved myself. I had fought against something I never should have understood, something that shouldn't have existed. But I wasn't the last one. There would always be someone else. Because there will always be readers. And the story is never truly over. Not until the last page is turned. Not until the last name is erased. And somewhere, right now, in some quiet little shop, on some dusty shelf, the magazine is still waiting for the next reader.